So welcome everybody to Grant Writing 101. I'm happy that you all were able to join us. I hope that this is a useful class for you all today. I'm excited to share this information with you. We certainly will be able to take questions throughout this, and so feel free to ask questions at any time. And I can't see everyone because there are so many people that are joining us right now, which is great, and there will be more. So the best thing to do to ask a question is to raise your hand using your participant icon or to chat the question in the question box. Okay. So my name is Nicole Heinbaugh. I am the program director with Bountiful Cities. And Bountiful Cities is an urban agriculture resource organization. We've been operating for 20 years. I've been with the organization for 5 years. And prior to being with Bountiful Cities, I've worked as a program director for 2 other organizations. And before that, I worked for lots of nonprofits also. So I have about 15 years of nonprofit management experience, grant writing experience. And I don't claim to be an expert at grant writing, but I have developed some expertise that I'm happy to share with you all because I think that it's such a useful and important skill for everybody to have. I want everybody to be able to access the resources they need to be able to do the work that they want to do. It's really important that people don't have that barrier to being able to do the work. So that's why we're doing this today. So I'm going to be toggling between 2 different screens because I have presenter notes on another screen. So if you see me looking back and forth, that's what's happening. So let's go ahead and jump in. So first, when you are getting started, you want to first understand what you would like to fund. Because you're going to see as we dive into this that there are different types of grants out there for different kinds of work. And so you want to first make sure that you know exactly what it is that you're applying to be funded. And then identify who will be holding the funds. So is it your organization? Is it another organization? And then we're going to be, you're going to be organizing useful reference information. And we'll go into all of these things. So this is the first section. I also want to let you all know that I do have a break built in because it's a long workshop, it's an intensive, and 3 hours of listening to somebody talk is quite a lot. So after we get into almost 2 hours in, we'll do a 10-minute break so that people can get up and walk around and take care of your own needs. Okay. So first we're going to look at what is it that you would like to fund? Is it a project? Is it a program? Is it an initiative? Oops. Or is it an organization or group? So if it's a project, projects are usually work that it's time limited. So there's a clear beginning and an end. I'm sorry, I have to okay, so Issa's, okay, great, Issa's in, thanks Issa. Okay, so a project is time limited. There's a clear beginning and an end. It usually requires one-time funding. And a project is different from a program because a program is typically work which is ongoing. So it requires ongoing funding support. An initiative is work that is typically collaborative, and it could be ongoing, or it could be time limited. So you want to kind of pay attention to that. Or you could be funding the organization or group that is actually performing the work. And all of these different types of activities that you might apply for funding have different kinds of funding affiliated with them. So the first step is really understanding what it is that you're trying to fund. Okay. Next, you're going to be identifying who will be holding the funds. So we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between the organization and the fiscal agent. The organization is typically the 501c3 nonprofit organization that is doing the work. So if you are already part of a 501c3 nonprofit organization, then you would apply as your organization. However, if you're doing work that is not tied to a 501c3 nonprofit organization, if you don't have that tax exempt status, then for most grant opportunities, you're going to want to find a fiscal agent. So a fiscal agent is going to be somebody an organization who does have the 501c3 nonprofit status that is able to steward your dollars that you receive from the funder. Now, most funders do ask that you apply through a 501c3 nonprofit organization. So this is why this is important. There are many groups out there doing excellent work that aren't currently nonprofits, but if you want to apply for grant funds, you'll have to find a fiscal agent to do this, usually. So if you have to find a fiscal agent, how do you do that? What does that mean? What do you look for? So who might be the right fit for fiscal agenting the work? First of all, you want to look at nonprofit partners who are already engaged in similar kinds of work. And the reason is because they're going to have a better understanding of the work that you do. You may already have a relationship with them. Their mission might be in alignment with the work that you're trying to do, which means that their fiscal agenting your work isn't going to be strange for their nonprofit status. It won't put their nonprofit status in jeopardy because you'll be doing, they'll be hosting funds for work which is in alignment with their own mission. You also want to look to see if any of these nonprofits who are either already engaged in the work, and so they know you know them, they know what it is you're doing, or they're aligned with the work. You want to find out if they actually have the capacity and willingness to fiscal agent your work, either for a one-time request or for ongoing funding and distribution. And that is a huge difference, whether you're looking at one time or you're looking at ongoing funding or distribution. That is very different, and we're going to talk about that. So you want to get really clear on the expectations, both for you and for the fiscal agent when you identify somebody. So are you looking at somebody to just fiscal agent one grant, a single grant? So if you are doing work and let's say it's a project, and so maybe it's just time limited and you need funds for this one project, then maybe the fiscal agent is only going to be fiscal agenting one grant request, or maybe they'll be fiscal agenting a couple of grant requests, but just for this specific project, which is time limited. That's a big difference between asking somebody to fiscal agent your program, which is going to require ongoing funding. So there is a difference there. There's a lot more work associated with fiscal agenting ongoing funding requests, okay? So you want to be clear in the beginning about which it will actually be. And then you want to also be clear about who will actually be writing and submitting the application. Are there any concerns about competing for funds? This is an important question, particularly if you're working with an organization that is already doing kind of similar work. They might be applying to the same funder. They might be applying for the same grant that you're applying for. And so if that's the case, it does not automatically disqualify you from being able to work with them as a fiscal agent. But what it does mean is that you're going to want to have that conversation with them, and then you're probably also going to want to have that conversation with the funder. And each funder really approaches this differently. Some funders really understand the need for fiscal agency, and they will not penalize your application or the fiscal agent's application if they receive two applications from the same organization, but one is as a fiscal agent for another group. So many funders will not penalize you for that as long as you're clear in the application that they're acting as a fiscal agent. Other funders haven't yet really begun to understand how the difference between an organization applying for something and a fiscal agent applying for something means that they're actually looking at funding two completely different organizations or different groups of work. Not all funders have become really clear on that, and so sometimes it can be a problem. So you want to have the conversation with the fiscal agent, the prospective fiscal agent, and with the funder. Also, you want to be clear on who's submitting, because typically fiscal agents aren't going to write your grant application for you. If you find the funding, they're typically going to allow you to use their 501c3. They'll supply you with the organization information that you need for your application. They may actually submit it for you if they have to go through their own online portal, but typically they're not going to write the application for you. So you want to be very clear about that. Also, you should talk about how much funding they're going to be fiscal agenting. So is it going to be, if it's an ongoing relationship that you're looking to develop, where you're actually fiscal agent, you're asking them to fiscal agent a program, and this program is going to have grant after grant, funding after funding. There's going to be a lot of money coming in and money coming out. If you're talking about a lot of resources that are going to be changing hands here, it might be, it might be a good idea to ask if they would be willing to open a separate checking account, a separate bank account for you, for your project. And the reason why this can be useful is it gives you a little bit more control and autonomy over how you spend your funds. It also can take the fiscal agent out of that middle person role when you need to be able to spend funds. So if you're able to access a debit card to spend your own funds that are in a totally separate bank account, that makes life easier for everybody. So let's see, sorry, got things clicking all over the place here. Okay, here we go. So not everybody is going to be okay with that. Not everybody is going to want to open a separate bank account for your project. If you're handling a lot of funds, though, it might be a good idea to request. Also, you want to talk about how many draws are you going to need to be able to make on the funding. Is it like a one-time kind of pass-through situation? You're applying for a grant, $2,500, you get the grant, they write you a check for $2,500. Is it like that? Or is it like, you know, you've got a $50,000 grant now and you need to draw it down incrementally over time? If that is true, if the latter is true, you need to really get clear on how is that going to happen. What's the time frame for making requests for disbursement of funds? How are you making purchases for your project or program? Are you making purchases, or are they making purchases? Are you asking for reimbursement on purchases that you've made? Just get very clear on this. Also, who is responsible for tracking the income and expenses of the arrangement? The answer on this is both parties. The fiscal agent has a responsibility to track the incoming and outgoing funds that they are handling for your project. But in all honesty, even large organizations, even large, well-equipped, experienced organizations have bookkeeping errors. It's not uncommon, and particularly with fiscal agency, it's something that not all bookkeepers are 100% familiar with yet, and so it's more likely to have errors with that than even with other kind of more typical income and expenses. So you want to really track your own money. When money comes in, you want to know about it. If it's going directly to the organization, you want to set up a system for learning how that money is coming in, learning about it right when it comes in, so that you can write thank you notes to donors if that's the case, or grantors, and also so that you can just track your books. Anytime you have expenses going out, whether it's payroll or program expenses, make sure to track that as well. You can use a simple spreadsheet, any kind of tool that you're comfortable with, but you want to be able to compare your numbers to their numbers to make sure that everything is straight. Also, there very well may be a fiscal agent fee involved. It is typical to have a fiscal agent fee for especially ongoing fiscal agent relationship. You know, if it's a one-time pass-through deal, there may not be. The organization might just be kind of doing a favor. But if it's an ongoing fiscal agent relationship, there will likely be a fee. And just to give you a kind of rule of thumb, a reference point, 10% is a pretty standard fiscal agent fee. So if somebody's asking for 10%, that's pretty normal. If they're asking for less than 10%, that's great. And if they're asking for very much more than 10%, you may want to negotiate downwards. Will there be 1099s involved in this transaction? Probably. But get clear on that in the beginning so that you know exactly what to expect and you can make sure to fill out the appropriate paperwork. Now, I don't know if you can see the bottom of the screen very well. It seems like my screen share might be sharing my computer menu, but the bottom line says, if necessary, set up an MOU, which is a memorandum of understanding. Now, I will tell you, this is a useful thing to have. You can include all the things that are listed here. It's a semi-legal document. It's something that is basically an agreement that you all can reference back to. If anything is unclear at any point, you can say, no, we actually talked about this. This is how we agreed to do it. I will tell you, though, that in all the years that I've been working with groups that have been fiscal agenting under our organization, we've never had an MOU. So it's not the most common thing in the world, but it is a tool that you can use if you choose. If you want to have it, you can. You can ask for one. Okay, I'm gonna move to the next slide, but this is a really, I recognize this is a dense slide. And so I wanna pause just for a second and find out if anybody has any questions. Okay. I'm not seeing any questions. Also, I want to let you all know that this whole thing that I set up here with being able to kind of toggle back and forth stopped working. It's technology, right? It just stopped. So I can't actually see, I can't see my notes. I don't know. I'm going to do the best I can to move through here with the speed that I think is right, because I've done this a few times, but yeah, I can't see my notes. So, all right, here we are. I'm going to move to the next slide. Okay. So you want to organize your reference information. This is a really important point. Before you even get started looking for grants, I really recommend you do this. And if you've been writing grants for a long time and you've never done this, I recommend doing this before you even write any more grants. It's so helpful to have this information in one place, because the truth is that most grants will ask for a lot of the same information every time. So if you have that information handy, it's just a quick copy paste rather than searching each time to pull together all of these different pieces. So the information that typically is requested on each grant application having to do with the organization, either yours or the fiscal agents. And this is something you want to get clear on, because a lot of times, so if it's asking for the 501c3 tax ID, which they all will, they're asking for the organization that is applying. So is that, if you're working with a fiscal agent, that's the fiscal agent's tax ID number. The date of incorporation is their date of incorporation. These are kind of legal documents. When you get into the mission, vision, values, history, all of that kind of stuff, you may actually want to have a conversation with the funder. I've seen this go either way. I've seen it where it says, oh, well, you're working with a fiscal agent. Yeah, just let us know what their mission, vision, values are. And then I've also seen where they say, no, actually, we just really want to know about the group's mission, vision, values, if you have that kind of information. So this is, if you are working with a fiscal agent, be sure to talk with the funder about these items. And have them handy, have all this information handy. Program descriptions, just a quick little write-up on each of your programs. so many applications just ask that question. What are all the programs your organization has? And if you have that written up, it's handy. Board of directors list, make sure it's current. A current annual budget for the organization. The compilation report. The compilation report is, it's like an audit. And so if you have a financial audit, just sub that. That's what that's referring to. But financial audits are very expensive. And so for smaller organizations, a compilation report is an alternative kind of audit that you can get that's way less expensive. And if your budget is smaller than, I don't know, typically 500,000 or something like that, most funders are really fine with a compilation report instead of an actual audit. The 990 tax exempt determination letter, just have all of that in a folder. I recommend using Google Drive. If you have, I keep a sheet, a document in Google that is called org info for grants. And I have all of this. I've got the tax ID number, date of incorporation, mission, vision, values, program descriptions. All of that stuff is just written up in one document so I can copy paste each time. I recommend that. And then if you're, of course, applying for different programs or initiatives, it's useful to also have accompanying information that is specific to those things. So talking about your program budget, your overall budget, for example, for the program, because many grant applications don't ask just for your grant budget. In other words, a budget of the dollars that you're requesting. But they also ask for your overall program budget for the program that you're looking to fund. So if you can go ahead and have that program budget handy, you don't have to create it or recreate it each time. Okay, next. Oh, I will also say letters of support. I'll mention here that letters of support are very useful. If you can gather letters of support for your specific program or initiative in advance, you can frequently reuse them for grants. And you can do that in two ways. One is you can keep the letters handy, and then you can, when a new grant application comes up where you want to attach letters of support for that same type of program that's being funded, you can talk with the person or individuals who wrote the letters of support originally and ask if you might update it with the new date and who it's to. And many people are really fine with that. And then you can just, you have them. They're already written, they're ready to go. You can update them and submit them. The other thing you can do is when you're attaching them, you could say recent letters of support. So that you're, it's clear that this is not being written specifically for this grant, but it is being written for this program. And so you can reuse them in that kind of way too. Okay, next slide. So once you've done some organizing, the next step is to find a funder. So you'll do that by researching foundations, finding the right fit, and then building that funder relationship. So the first step is to research foundations. Let's see here, I have too many little screens open. So once you have an understanding of the type of work you want to fund, it's best to find a grant that fits that work that you're looking to fund, rather than finding a grant that's available and then creating work to fit that grant. Sometimes, occasionally, that latter part of finding a grant and then creating work to fit that grant. Sometimes the work that you create to fit the grant falls directly into alignment with the work that you've been wanting to do anyway. And in that case, that's fine. That's great. But more often than not, you have work that you're doing already, and you want to be able to continue to do that work. And the way to be able to continue to do that work is to fund that work. So find a grant that fits that work. And then you're going to prioritize what types of foundations to research in this next step. So there are different kinds of foundations. There are local private foundations or local government foundations. There are family foundations, statewide or regional foundations that are private, national, private, or federal grants. And there are pros and cons to each of these different types of funders, especially if you are a smaller organization, especially if you are looking to fund really geographically localized work. So that's work within a specific city or county. And especially if the work that you're doing is not directly affecting just a ton of people. You know, if you have a program or project you're trying to fund that is affecting a dozen people or a few dozen people, then in all of those scenarios, you really want to focus first on looking at local funding. Local and regional funding is really going to be the best place to start. If you have a lot of experience with grant writing, or you're trying to fund a program or project which is expansive, you know, it covers a large geographic area, or it serves just like a ton of people, then it makes more sense to look at statewide or regional, statewide or national foundations. Regional foundations will typically fund smaller scale work, but statewide typically wants to see a little bit larger scale. Now, national for sure wants to see larger scale. This is where you're talking about, we serve hundreds or thousands of people. Sometimes statewide, like Z. Smith Reynolds, for example, different kinds of funders that are statewide will fund smaller projects. It depends on their mission, but we'll talk about that also, how to be able to figure out kind of which foundation to go for. All right. So we talked about some of this. There are pros and cons. Local private or government-based foundations are more likely to fund local work, small-scale work. Family foundations are great. Family foundations are really easy to work with typically once you receive the funds. Even a lot of times the application process is pretty easy. But to be honest, family foundations are hard to find. They don't tend to advertise as widely as other kinds of private or government foundations. So you typically would find a family foundation through word of mouth. But if you can find one through word of mouth and maybe even get an introduction, they are such an easy kind of foundation to work with typically, because a lot of family foundations like to develop personal relationships with organizations doing work, and they like to fund them repeatedly, typically. And also the reporting requirements are often much less stringent than other types of foundations. Statewide or regional private foundations are also frequently great to work with, and they do tend to fund smaller scale local work. Sometimes they provide large sums, larger sums even than local private or government-based foundations many times. And there's no set rule for any of this. This is all a generalization to kind of give you some tips. But if you are going to work with a statewide or regional funder, make sure that they are funding work in your county, in your area, because they don't fund, not all statewide or regional funders fund all work in that state or region. Federal government-based grants are the most complex. They're the most tedious. They require the most reporting, but they can provide really large sums. I recommend that if you haven't worked with federal government-based grants before, that you try to partner with somebody who has, so that you can get some experience with that, because they're kind of a different beast in some ways. Nationwide private foundations are much more likely to fund large-scale program work rather than small-scale. Okay, now we're going to get organized again. So I really recommend using some type of a spreadsheet to list each of the foundations that you locate and record useful information about each one of these foundations. So the name, their website link, what kind of grants they have, due dates, program officers, maybe when you spoke with program officers, have that be a column. The geographic scope they typically fund, their priorities, funding range. All of this information you can find. It all becomes available if you start to go down the rabbit hole of research. And so having to only do that research once is useful, so that you can then see, okay, so these are the funders that I know kind of fit all the parameters I'm looking for. I don't have to go searching every year. I'm going to apply to these funders each year, and I'll add to that list. I really recommend doing that. I'm also going to share with you a list that has already been put together that is excellent to be able to see who is funding locally, regionally. So CFWNC is the Community Foundation of Western North Carolina, and I'm going to click through this top link on the screen here so that you can see this list. And I'll tell you that when I send these slides out as a PDF, you'll be able to see all this, but I will also send that funders list as an attachment as well. So you don't have to click through to find the funders list. I'll just send that to you along with the packet that you get after this workshop. Okay, so still doing screen share. I hope that you all can see this. I will say it's a little strange talking in absolute silence. But I will just keep going unless anybody has any questions. So this is the document that I'm going to share with you in addition to the slides. The Community Foundation of Western North Carolina creates one of these documents every year. And when I first started grant writing, this was the go-to document that I used to determine who I wanted to request funding from. So I'm going to show you what this looks like. What they do is they compile all these funders who fund in North Carolina, and also who fund specifically to our county or our region. They list them in alphabetical order. They contain just a ton of useful information. And you can literally just scroll through and see where you might find a fit for your organization or for the work that you're trying to do. And they have the links here for all of these foundation websites. So one thing is you want to use a document like this as a starting point, because information changes over time, and particularly in our region, now that we have a lot of newer kind of foundations that people are accessing, some of this information changes pretty regularly. So you can start with this to kind of narrow down the foundations that you want to research, but then go directly to the foundation's websites themselves in order to verify the information here and also to find out some additional information. So I've been going pretty slowly. I'm just going to scroll pretty quickly now so that you can see. This is the Community Foundation of Western North Carolina is a funder that makes a lot of different kinds of grants. And so they have those types of grants listed here as well. Lots and lots and lots. So this is actually, let's see, 19 pages long. So this is a useful resource that I am very happy to share with you all. Okay. The next resource that I want to share with you quickly is this next link here at the bottom. And this is a website link rather than a PDF. So this I'm not going to share separately when I send out the packet. This is one that you'll just want to link through in the slides. So the Grantsmanship Center compiles this list of the top giving foundations in North Carolina. And you can see here that they have them listed out. They have the foundations listed, and they have them ranked by how much they give each year. This is useful. So you can see the Foundation for the Carolinas is ranked #1. They give out almost $400 million annually. And each one of these foundations is linked, so you can click through to their own website. So if you're looking for a large foundation, this is a good list of the kind of largest foundations that are operating in North Carolina right now. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. So this is a new slide that I've added because we're operating in a different time right now, and it's important to be responsive to what's going on around us, because to be honest, all of this information that I'm giving you, if I had given it to you 3 months ago, it would have been correct for that time. But now that I'm giving it to you now, so many funders are shifting and changing what it is that they're prioritizing for their funds. Many funders have kind of hit pause with their typical grant making efforts because everybody is trying to figure out how best to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic and how to make funds available for emergency response efforts related to this. So while you could go through the PDF that I just shared with you that has all these funders listed out, and you could see all these different grant opportunities and all the deadlines, and you might find some that line up perfectly with what you're trying to do, it also could be that those particular funders have halted those grant funds, those grant funding programs, so that they can make grants that are specific to COVID-19 emergency response. So this is something to be aware of. The funding landscape has changed. Whether this is a temporary change or not is still to be determined. But because the landscape has changed, I want to give you all some additional resources. So here are some funding opportunities that are specific to COVID-19 kind of emergency response work. This list was originally compiled by CFS, which is Community Food Strategies. And so I just basically pulled the same list because I've gone through all these resources and some of them are really useful. This first one I'll show you just very quickly is the North Carolina Network of Grant Makers. So this list is updated pretty regularly. These are COVID-19 grants and response funds. If you scroll down just this page, the link takes you right there. It has listed a compilation of a lot of different kinds of funds that are currently available through different funders across the state, and some that are very specific to our region for COVID response work. So you can see here, the Community Foundation of Western North Carolina is listed. Some of this information, even though we're looking at dates that say less than a month ago, like March 25th, for example, some of these funds are already expended. So not all of them, certainly, but it's just an example of how the changing funding climate that we find ourselves in right now is changing very quickly. It is a very quickly evolving funding climate that is very different from what existed 3 months ago. So if you find an opportunity that's been listed that is particular to COVID-19 emergency funds, do understand that those funds are likely to be used up very quickly. So even if there's like some of these grant makers will do kind of rolling deadlines with those types of funds, even if it's rolling and you feel like you have time to really kind of sort out what it is that you're trying to apply for and maybe line up some partners and, you know, take a couple weeks in pulling it all together, there may not be a couple weeks worth of funds. That's the truth of it. So I do want to impress upon you then how useful it is to have your organizations and programs information organized in advance, because the less time that you can spend on all of that, you know, background kind of work, the more quickly you can apply for these funds, which are coming and going at a very rapid pace. So this, as one of the slides that I'll share with you, all of these links will be available for you. So once you have narrowed down which funders you want to work with, you want to then start to study each foundation separately. So you're going to go through whatever link you find for them to go directly to their website. And you want to look up as much information as you can. What you want to find is you want to review their mission, their vision, Pay attention to the language that they use. You can learn a lot, I think, about an organization's ideals by paying attention to the language they use. And if their language is in alignment with the language you use, then that's one helpful indicator that they might be a good fit. Look at their grant programs. Really take a look at their funding history. Most even perhaps funders do include their funding history, so you can actually go through and look to see exactly who they funded and for how much and what the work was that was being funded. That's really great information, because if you can look at that and see, okay, so within my geographic area, I know that organization, I know the type of work they do, I know how many people they serve, I know generally about their operating budget, and this is how much they were funded. That gives you a reference point for what you can ask for from that funder, because you're going to know then, okay, so comparatively speaking, I don't have a relationship with this funder, so I'm probably not going to go the biggest bucks, possible with my request. I'm going to go kind of middle of the road, and I can see that they fund the type of work I'm doing, so that's good. And I can see that they fund a lot for this scope, but my scope is here. So I'm going to take a look at this reference point and I'm going to scale it back accordingly. I'm going to make it fit the work I'm doing. That is helping you identify kind of what your request might look like. And it's really useful to get that figured out in advance, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So you want to take a look at their application process as well when you go online to research them. Are you submitting a full application right from the start, or are you submitting an LOI first? So an LOI is a letter of intent, and that is something that many funders request in order to then be potentially invited to complete a full application. So rather than dealing with a gajillion full-length applications, which can be very long, they could be 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 15 pages long, they want to only ask for full applications from those organizations that they feel like would be a good fit for their funding. And that is what a letter of intent does. It's basically a mini application. They just ask you a few questions, and then if they decide that you're in alignment with what they want to fund, they'll invite you to submit a full application. So make sure that when you are paying attention to the dates and things, if they do have an LOI, make sure that you are looking at the LOI date and the full application date, so that you don't inadvertently miss the LOI date and then you're not able to submit a full application. You want to take a look at, can anyone apply, or is it by invitation only? If it's by invitation only, that's tricky. It means you need to have a relationship with them of some kind. So you're going to need to talk with them, or you're going to need to get some kind of an introduction. Let's see. You want to make sure that the due date is far enough off that you are going to have time to really complete this application. There are lots of times when a grant comes up and it's 1 week out and it's like, okay, we're going to scramble and we're going to work really hard and pull all this together. We're going to put everything else on hold and we're going to do nothing but this grant because it's due in a week and we really want to get it. That is not a fun way to work. It happens. It happens. So many things happen last minute in this world. I'm not saying never do that, but if you can help it, try to not do that as your norm. That will make grant writing so much harder, because you don't have the time to do as good a job as you want. It can feel really stressful, and really, especially if you haven't worked with that funder before, the process just, a lot of times it just takes longer than a week. So you could find yourself at the end, after pulling all these all-nighters with a deadline that you just can't reach. So I recommend looking at grant opportunities that are at least 3 weeks away. It gives you ample time to work through stuff. And ideally, if you've never worked with a funder before, maybe a month away. Yeah, and then take a look at the decision dates and when they release the funds. If you have a program that is going to require funds in order to purchase food to feed students in August, for example, then you don't want to apply for funding that isn't going to be released until October. So pay special attention to when those funds are released. And also pay attention to whether, if it says, if the funds are reimbursement based or not, because that could be a cash flow issue for your organization. Many funders do actually do reimbursement basis, not all. And I would say not most funders operate that way, but many do. Particularly local government funders operate on a reimbursement basis frequently. So pay attention to that, because if you can, if your organization can afford the outlay of expenses in advance and then request reimbursement for expenses that were already paid for, and then can afford to wait 3 weeks potentially for payment, okay. But if your organization can't really do that, if the cash flow is not substantial enough to enable that, then I don't recommend looking at reimbursement basis funds. Oh, I'm going to show you a link now. We'll see how this works. I'm going to try to do this. Okay, so we're going to look at the, another thing you're going to look at is the current and previously funded partners. And we talked about that a little bit, where you're going to be checking out the locations of work, the size of the grants, the scope of work being funded, the type of work being funded, to make sure that you're kind of in alignment with the funding choices and to identify how much you want to be able to ask for. So now I'm going to take you to the Sisters of Mercy Foundation website. This is a local funder. They fund in North Carolina. They are by invitation only, so that you know. So I'm going to show you kind of what you can find on their website. So here's their mission and vision. The Sisters of Mercy, as a ministry of the Institute of the Sisters of Mercy of Americas, seeks to improve the quality of life for the economically poor, especially women, children, and elderly, by supporting effective education, healthcare, and social service organizations that have systemic impact, that's interesting and important, and empower those without a voice. So you can really start to get an idea of the foundation already, just from their mission. So then you want to read through their vision. And then if you want to look and see who they've been funding, you can look here at what we fund. You can see where they have listed their funding priorities. So they're telling you here that they're looking at healthcare, education, social service organizations. They value collaboration, evidence-based. Let's see. Here are the different types of grants that they will consider making. So ongoing operating expenses for individual organizations. Oh, that's a good one. Operating expenses are so few and far between. If you can find somebody to give you operating expenses, go for that, because they're unrestricted typically. And we'll get into that a little bit later. And they also do specific program or project expenses. So I'm going to show you here where it says recent grants. And this is telling you who they funded. So this says March 15th, 2020. So this is very recent. So in the area of education, here you see a lot of Charlotte-based organizations, Brevard. Now here's Asheville. Here's Children First Communities and Schools of Buncombe County was awarded $50,000 to support salaries and benefits at 5 elementary schools and 4 after-school programs. Okay, so that tells you a lot of information right there. You may know Children First. They're a prominent organization in our area, so you know the kind of work they do. $50,000 is a decent size grant. That's a good size grant. And they're supporting salaries and benefits. That's great. That's basically operating expenses that aren't usually funded, to be honest, as readily by other funders. But you can see here that they're funding the salaries and benefits of student support specialists at 5 elementary schools and 4 after-school programs. That's a huge scope, right? So these specialists are working with, I don't know, a couple thousand children, potentially, between 5 elementary schools and 4 after-school programs. 3,000 children. So they're geographically local, but they're serving a lot of people. But it's also general operating, which is great. So you can see here, here's more Charlotte. Here's another Asheville City Schools Foundation, Bakersville, Monroe, Charlotte, and then into social services. Boone, Monroe, Charlotte. So we're noticing a theme here. They like to fund Charlotte. They're not funding as many organizations in Asheville, good to know. But here's another Asheville, Helpmate, for $60,000 to support clinician, supportive counselor, and case management salaries. Again, it's salaries. This is the operating, the overhead expenses that are so infrequently funded. Now, if you're familiar with Helpmate, they're a domestic violence shelter. They do have different programs, but their scope of service is not thousands of people typically, right? It's going to be dozens or maybe hundreds of people. And still it was 60,000 to support all these different kinds of salaries. So anyway, this is an example of how you can kind of go through and get an idea of the type of work that they're funding, particularly in your area, how much funding they're doing in your area, and what the numbers look like in terms of how many people are served by these different services, and what kind of geographic range is being covered. Okay, just gonna check real quick and see if we have any questions. I know Isa is helping me moderate, but okay, I don't see any hands raised, so good. I hope this is all making sense to everyone. I wish I could be with you in person. It's really fun to teach this in person, and we can actually have a conversation about it. But I will hopefully be able to offer it in person again. And if you want, you can come to that one too, if this is useful. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a little bit more about programmatic support versus operational support. So multi-year operational support really is the beautiful unicorn of the nonprofit world, the funding world. It provides you with, generally with unrestricted funds. Operational support is what allows you to pay for salaries and rent and utilities and insurance and professional fees, printing and postage and mileage, all of those things that are so often not included in those programmatic grants. So usually if you have a grant that is program specific, the bulk of that funding is going to be to support the maybe salaries and materials purchases and things like that that are specific to that program. And then usually you can include like 10% for your administrative expenses, they call it, admin expenses. If you have that 10% in each one of your programmatic support grants, chances are you're still not going to have enough administrative funding when it's all said and done to actually pay for all of your administrative costs. So salaries like executive director salaries, for example, other types of director salaries, HR salaries, things like that, aren't covered typically by programmatic grants outside of that one little 10% line item. So being able to really draw down general operating support, operational support, is crucial for an organization to be able to be sustainable. It really is important. Otherwise, you just find yourself chasing your tail all the time. And many organizations find themselves in a spot where they're unfortunately reallocating program funds for operational expenses. And that's a bit of a mess, because what that does is it means that you have to keep the lights on, but then you can't do your work that makes you the organization that you are in the first place, and that you said you were going to do in order to receive that funding. So when it comes time for reporting, that can be a real problem if you weren't able to do the work you wanted to do. And it's a lot of stress for everybody involved. So do find that mixture of programmatic support to fund your programs and operational support to adequately fund your operations. I want to tell you just briefly about the unicorn in our local funding world, which is the United Way. So our United Way of Asheville and Buncombe County is a fairly large United Way. It's a fairly large funder in our area. It funds specifically for our city and county. It operates pretty autonomously. United Ways all over the country operate semi-autonomously. They certainly can make their own funding decisions. They request their own funds and they make their own funding decisions. So in that way, they operate autonomously. They have been doing a lot of shifting in recent years, and really, in my opinion, shifting toward a very helpful direction, which is that they want to be more useful to organizations out there. So they have made all of their grants operational. So even though you would be applying where your work would be aligning with a very specific focus area and strategy that they're looking to fund, even though the work that you're applying for is programmatic, the grant that you receive is operational. So that means you can use the funds however you want. They've made the application process really easy. They've made the reporting process really easy. I've never seen an easier budgeting process. And they have multi-year funding available. So that means that if you get a grant now, and then maybe get a grant again the next year, you could potentially apply to receive multi-year funding instead of single-year funding. So then that same grant amount you would just get year after year without having to reapply. So you would just submit your reports and you would continue to receive that funding year after year. That's amazing. Most funders don't offer that. It is a best practice that is being conceived of now in the funding world. So more are beginning to offer that, but really a lot don't do that. So thank you, United Way, for doing that. The other cool thing that they do is they have started to really, really value equity. And so this last funding cycle, any of their funded partners received, if they chose, an additional $1,000 on top of whatever grant that they got to be able to use for furthering their own equity-related work as an organization in any way they chose. So whether that was supporting more diverse hiring, or whether that was training and workshop attendance for their staff, or putting systems in place to have greater power sharing kind of equity within their organization. They could use it for whatever they wanted as long as it was in alignment with furthering the cause of equity within their organization. That's fantastic. So I wanted to let you know that the United Way is doing all these things. They're also hard to get into, as you can imagine. They're highly sought after. The applications are highly competitive. And another thing that makes them great, but also makes them hard to access, is that once you get in with the United Way, once you become a funded partner of the United Way, it's much easier to continue to receive funding. It's the only truly, really stable funding source out there that I've come across in the local funding world. So a big kudos to them and a plug for them. If you all want to pursue that funding, I definitely recommend it. Okay, so next you're going to be building a funder relationship. You want to have, you're going to be talking with a funder, hopefully. This is part of what I'm recommending, is you want to talk with a funder. Before you talk with them though, take some notes. Really do your research that we've been talking about, and really write down what it is that you think you're going to be applying for. Like, what's the range that you think you would be applying for? And with that range, what is it that you think you would be funding? What is the work that you think you're going to fund? And how does that work really relate to their mission and vision and priorities? What kind of outcomes do you expect you might be able to achieve from that work? You really want to do all of that thinking before you talk with the program officer. And what I've found is that I have a much easier time having that conversation with the program officer if I've actually written all of it down. So I can reference it so that I don't freeze in the middle of a conversation and I can't remember, and that's not a good look, and you're trying to, get on your best foot. So I recommend really, really writing it down and going into the conversation prepared. So you're going to want to actually call the program officer if they're available. Usually they are available. Usually their website will list the program officer that you can call, and there may be different officers for different areas of funding that they offer. So you want to find which is the right program officer for you. Once you get them on the phone, so you're doing a couple things. You're developing a relationship, but also this is a great opportunity to really extract some information. So once you have all this information in place about what it is you think you want to fund, how much you think you might ask for, what kind of outcomes you can expect, all that stuff, you want to ask if you want to run through that stuff with them, and then ask if they feel like your work is in alignment with their funding priorities. I will tell you that even if you read on the website that it says they are interested in funding X, Y, and Z, and you're like, well, that's fabulous because we do X. That is the work we do. I have had multiple occasions where then I've talked to a program officer over the phone, and even though their stated priority appears to be in direct alignment with the work that we're doing, in speaking with them, I learn, oh, actually, it's not exactly in alignment, because sometimes it's because the decision-making board is an all-volunteer group that changes frequently with the foundation. That's possible. And that the decision-making group has its own kind of particular priorities. And you would just not ever know that unless you talked with a program officer. You also want to ask for any recommendations the program officer might have related to your grant request. So you want to be careful with this because they can't write your grant for you, and they don't want to appear to be giving an advantage to one organization over another. Sometimes they answer these questions in really general terms, but it is useful to say, okay, once you've run through all of this information that you've already compiled, to say, you know, this funding amount, this request amount that we're talking about here, is this in alignment with what you would consider funding with, you know, for this particular kind of work? Or you could say, is there a range of funding that you recommend applicants work within, for example? So whatever kind of information you can tactfully try to elicit from the program officer, I recommend really taking that opportunity to learn as much as you can about the foundation. And if they know you and they're familiar with your work, that relationship building can help. They might not be the decision makers, they usually aren't the decision makers for grants, but they're a liaison to the decision makers. So if you have been developing a relationship with a program officer, and they're now semi-familiar with your work, and then they see your application come in, and then the decision-making team has questions about your work, they might be able to help answer those questions. They might even be able to advocate for you. Having a good relationship with your program officer can sometimes really mean the difference between getting that grant and not getting it. Okay, so now we are at the section related to writing your grant. Can you all believe that we just spent all this time talking about grant writing, and we haven't even talked yet about actually writing the grant? That is just an indicator for how important it is to do this work in advance, to get really well organized before you even sit down to write the grant. So what I'd like to do right now, oops, I see that we have a chat. Let me check real quick. Oh, I see. Somebody said unstable internet, will need to listen later. Okay, no problem. This is going to be recorded, so I can also make that recording available to you all after it's finished. So what we're going to do now is take a break. It's time to go ahead and take a 10-minute break. We're actually working ahead of schedule, so maybe not having my notes is helpful. We're going to take a 10-minute break. So right now it is 2:13. If we could come back at 2:23, we'll plan to get started at 2:25. I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording. And if anybody would like to hang on and have questions with me in the meantime during this break, you're welcome to do that. You can unmute yourself and do that. Okay, thanks. Okay, so this next section is going to focus on the process of actually writing your grant. The first thing that you want to do is develop the budget, and we're going to spend some time with that because it's, in my opinion, it's the most important first step that you can take, even though it may feel counterintuitive. It might feel like, you know, it's a grant application, you want to really dive into the narrative questions, and the budget is an attachment that you're going to upload later. I don't recommend approaching it that way. I really recommend starting with the budget, because the budget is going to tell your story about your numbers, your outcomes, all of that. What you can expect to fund with the dollars that you're requesting. All of that becomes clear in your budget, and it's going to help you answer your narrative questions. So developing the budget, writing the narrative, and then uploading attachments. Okay, so the first step, developing the budget. Like I said, I really recommend always, always, always do this first. It is going to help your process immensely. It's going to help inform your narrative questions. So when you're completing a budget, you want to be sure that you're really considering the true costs of your work. So that means don't forget to include these items. Staff time is important, and all your staff time, not just the sort of minimal amount of staff time you think might be affiliated with it, because things always take longer. And a good rule of thumb is to estimate an additional 10%. Another rule of thumb is that things always take 1.5 times as long to do as you think they will. So put ample staff time in there. And when you do put staff time in, don't forget to include your payroll taxes and your workers' comp. And the reason why I recommend that is because those are still expenses that your organization is going to have for being able to pay your staff to do this work. And if you don't include those expenses in your grant budget, you won't have the dollars to be able to pay for it, and it will just come from someplace else. So do put those. If you're looking for a general kind of rule of thumb about how much to include for payroll taxes and workers' comp, I typically work with the number 0.092. It's not a totally arbitrary number. I found that number through doing an average of the amount of payroll taxes associated with a lot of different staff, because depending on how people complete their W-4 and how much in taxes are being taken out of their check, and how much is then being contributed, it can look a little different per person. But a good rule of thumb is that if you do 0.092, it will likely cover all of your payroll taxes that the organization has to pay, and most, if not all, of your workers' comp. And of course, workers' comp is also different for every organization, but it should cover a portion of it related to that person's salary. Administrative and fiscal agent expenses. As I mentioned, with programmatic grants, typically they will allow you to include administrative expenses up to about 10% of your overall request. Meeting supports. If the program that you're requesting dollars for requires meetings, bringing together groups of people, particularly if the groups of people who are coming together are community members and not just other, specifically nonprofit professionals, then it's really important to include the supports necessary to remove any kind of barriers to participation. for those meetings. So that could include childcare, interpretation, translation, which is different from interpretation. Translation it refers to the written word, whereas interpretation refers to the spoken word. And refreshments. It's always a good idea to have food for meetings with other people. It kind of makes everything go a little bit more smoothly. So I'll tell you a little bit about the dollar amounts that I've included here. You'll notice something for the rates here. For childcare, you see it's $25 an hour. For down below, you see direct support to individuals or participant compensation, $25 an hour. Leadership team compensation, $25 an hour. I use that rate as a fairly standard rate for all of these different ways that you might pay people to either participate or support this work. Because if they're not on staff with a specific payroll, you want to really value their time, and you want to value their time in a way that also maybe makes the assumption that they might be having to pay taxes out of those dollars. They might have to complete some kind of a 1099 or something like that. And if that's the case, you want to have enough funds there that you're not inadvertently making their take-home pay even less. So $25 an hour values everybody at a high rate, whether they're providing childcare or they're participating, community member participating in a conversation or providing input, or another nonprofit professional working as part of a leadership team with planning and operational support. It values everybody the same, and that's really important. Interpretation is listed at $90 an hour because if you have English to Spanish and Spanish to English interpretation happening, simultaneous interpretation requires at least 2 people. It's very intensive, and people need a break after a period of time. So you end up, what you're actually paying is $45 an hour per person for that professional service, and there are 2 people. So it's a good rule of thumb to budget around $90 an hour for that service. If you're looking for a good Spanish to English or English to Spanish and English to Spanish interpretation service, there's a local sort of grassroots founded cooperative interpretation service called Cenzontle, spelled Cenzontle, Cenzontle, and I recommend them. They're excellent. They do wonderful work, and it's a really good way to support local community efforts. Facilitation and consultation. If you are going to hire a professional facilitator to facilitate your meetings, which I recommend, it is very helpful to have professional facilitation for a number of different kinds of meetings, not just for your strategic planning session, but also for your long-term planning work, community planning work, that type of work. Professional facilitation is really, really helpful. And you can expect to pay somewhere between $80 and $125 an hour, and you can budget that. I would recommend budgeting the higher end because that's more common. I will say that there are lots of professional facilitators and consultants who charge much, much more than that. So $125 an hour used to be pretty standard for the high end of nonprofit facilitation. Things may be shifting a little bit. Certainly, lots of people are being paid more than that. So, if you have a facilitator that you have in mind for that work, talk to them in advance before you do the budget so that you have an idea of what they would charge. And then you can just be as accurate as possible in the budget rather than just trying to guess. Direct support to individuals or participant compensation. Like I said, I use $25 an hour for that as well. It is really important to provide participant compensation wherever you can. It's one of those barriers to participation that you want to remove if possible. And also, if you're asking people to participate because you want them to bring their lived experience to the table, that is a form of expertise that is just as important as the professional expertise in the room, and you want to value that expertise. So see people that you're inviting into these meetings from neighborhoods and from communities, see them as experts in their field, which is their community, in their neighborhoods, right? See them as experts and value them like that. Leadership team compensation. If you're working on some kind of a long-term sort of planning project, I do recommend having a leadership team. If it's a collaborative project, having a number of people who are working together to make the overall kind of decisions and guide the efforts of the work. And if you do have a leadership team, it's really great to actually compensate people for their time. And then, of course, any kind of program or project supplies. It depends on the need for the work, needs of the work. Excuse me. If you have to purchase flip charts, markers, name tags, toys for the children, if you're offering childcare and you want to make sure you have activities for them, include all of that in your program and project supplies. So what I'd like to do now is I'm actually going to show you an example budget really quick. So this is a budget that is for a planning project, a planning initiative. It's the WNC Food Justice Planning Initiative. It's a regional planning initiative that some of you might know about. Some of you might even be part of it. So it takes place across the 18-county area. We do have a leadership team. We do have facilitation. And I wanted to show you this, this example, this budget, because I want you to see all the different line items that are listed, and also how what we had originally thought about those line items changed over time when we had more information. Actually, after we had actually gotten started with the planning project, we realized we needed to amend the budget. So this is just an example. This is an expense budget. So community member participation or compensation, or organizational participation or compensation. You can see that the rate here is $25 an hour, and that's whether people are coming directly from a neighborhood that's most directly affected, that we want to be sure is included in the planning process, that their voice can be heard, or whether that's another nonprofit professional or a business professional. It's the same rate. Like I said, everybody's time should be valued. So originally we had thought, $14,000 would be the right amount. And then once we got into the work, we realized we didn't need as much of those dollars because this was an optional compensation. That way we could have more funds available for the people who needed it, and could spend less funds on the major large organization representatives that didn't actually need that compensation in order to be there. And so it turned out that not as many people really requested the compensation as we originally thought. So that's why that line item changed. Originally, we didn't even include mileage compensation, but as we got into the project, we realized, oh my gosh, it's a regional initiative. People are driving in from all over this 18-county area. We better remove that barrier to participation as well. We need to pay people mileage if we can. So that budget, that line item changed considerably. And then we have a leadership team. That line item changed as well. It is so easy and common to underestimate the amount of time that planning takes. So it's also, especially when you're working within a particular dollar range, you want to try to, maximize each line item. And so it can be tempting sometimes to kind of estimate things conservatively. But I will tell you that if you find that you're estimating a certain amount of time, go ahead and add 10% to that time at least, or even multiply it by 150%, because it always takes longer than we think it will. So you can see how that line item changed after we realized that the planning in between the meetings in particular was going to take much more time than we originally thought. Administrative compensation. This is a really important line item. If you have a planning project like this, like I said, I recommend facilitation, but the other type of support, professional support I recommend is administrative assistant support. And this is a person who might take the notes in the meetings, the designated person to take the notes and get paid for it, the person who might send out meeting reminders, the person who might transcribe flip chart information, they might help with arranging logistics. They could even potentially do some research analysis for you if that's needed and if that's part of their skill set. Having a line item for somebody to just be able to be paid to do that extra kind of work in this type of project is really, really useful. I really recommend including that. Here you can see facilitation. We underestimated the amount of facilitation dollars and time that we would need, so that was an adjustment. We have a consultation line item here for originally $2,400 and now $1,000. That was a TBD line item. We don't have somebody in mind for that. We don't have a service in mind. We just thought, you know, it's possible that as we get through this planning process, we're going to need somebody's expertise. So we kind of built that in, but it's also an area that we can draw from if we need to for other line items. Childcare, certainly, I recommend childcare. This line item became reduced because we didn't end up needing as much childcare. We were able to organize the meetings during a time of day that worked for the participants. So we didn't actually need childcare in the same way that we thought originally. Interpretation and translation, that was drastically changed. It was one of the things we offered, but once again, people didn't request it. And so if it wasn't requested, then we didn't have it present at each meeting. So we were able to adjust that line item. Supplies, that includes refreshments, and then a fiscal agent fee. So you can see that standard 10% fiscal agent fee. So that is an example of a budget that really contains the types of line items that I recommend taking a look at for ongoing, especially planning work, and a lot of other kinds of program work also could benefit from a number of those lines. Okay. Okay, writing the narrative. Now we're finally at the point of actually writing the grant. We're only almost 2 hours in. But it's just an example of how important all these kind of surrounding activities are for really preparing you to write the narrative and to be able to submit the best grant that you can. So one thing that I recommend with writing the narrative is most, maybe all, I don't know, I don't want to say all, but most grant applications are online now. Hasn't always been that way, but thank goodness it's that way now. And so with online grant applications, you have different kinds of portals that you have to go through to submit your grant application, and they are notoriously glitchy. So that means that you could be working within your portal, typing your narrative questions, you could be working for hours, and then something happens and all your work is gone and you lose everything. I'm speaking from experience there. That's definitely happened to me a couple times. And so what I do now and what I recommend for people to do to avoid that is to copy all of the narrative questions from the online portal into a Google document or a Word document if you prefer. I use Google Docs for everything, so you'll see me reference that a lot. But if you're not a Google Docs person, copy it into a Word document. The point is to get it out of the portal and into a working space so that you can work on your grant answers safely without things being deleted. When you copy the narrative questions, be sure to also include the word or character count limit affiliated with each of the questions. Most questions do have a character limit. A typical character limit for most questions is around 2,000 characters. give or take. So questions that require very short answers, you might see a character limit count of 500. Questions that actually want you to go on and on and on about things and really provide enough space for you to say everything you want to say might have a character limit count of 5,000 characters. But 2,000 is pretty standard, or 1,500. The reason why you want to copy that over is because when you're working on your answers, you can actually check your own character count or word count as you're working. So let's talk about that then. How do you work through this stuff? I really recommend, so if you're going to be copying all this stuff through, it gives you the sort of added advantage of reading through all the questions as you're copying them over. But even if you decide not to do that extra step and you just want to type directly into the portal, I don't recommend it, but if you do it, do make sure that you read through the entire application first. Before you type anything, read through the entire application. You want to get really familiar with what questions are being asked so that you know what kind of information you need to compile, and also so that you know how you want to divide up the information you're sharing between different questions. Because you'll notice in certain grant applications, a lot of grant applications, some of the questions are similar. So you could actually answer similarly for multiple questions in the application. So you want to kind of be able to plan out which information you're sharing is most relevant to which question. And you're only going to know that if you read all the questions in advance. Now, the other thing is, don't just read the narrative questions in advance. You also want to take a look at the additional documentation that needs to be uploaded. This is very important. You might have a grant application that you look at the narrative questions and you think, oh yeah, no problem. I've got this. I can do this. I've got this information. I've done my budget. I know how to answer this stuff. I'll fly through it. I can wait and just give myself a few days to work on this one. And it should be plenty of time. And then when you get to the attachment section, you have to upload something that might take a long time to put together that you didn't even realize you were going to need to provide. Maybe you need to create a theory of change document. You know, that's not unheard of. It's not super common, but it's not unheard of. Or you might be required to upload letters of support that you didn't realize you had to get in advance. You don't want to be surprised by what you have to upload at the end. So make sure to look at that first and to really plan that into your timing of how long you're going to give yourself to complete this application. When you are in the process of answering your narrative questions, the way that I recommend actually writing your answers, this is basically persuasive writing, right? That's what grant writing is. It's not really mysterious. It's just persuasive writing. So what you want to do is I recommend starting by writing everything that you want to say. Really think about the question, pull together all of your information, and then say everything you want to say. And then take a look at your character count or your word count, see where you are, and start to edit it down. So you're going to edit it down to the point where you have removed all of the unnecessary language that we tend to throw in, especially when we're speaking, you know, in a way that's more conversational than persuasive writing. So you're going to make it concise. You're going to make it the type of answer that certainly fits within the character limit and that is still saying what you want to say, but just in a much more clear and direct kind of way. I do recommend that you try to avoid using a conversational tone if you can, but still allow your language to flow. You don't want to be super jargony. You don't want to swing the whole way from conversational into professional language that is overly jargony, because surprisingly, maybe, even though you might be really familiar with the acronyms and the jargon of your profession and the type of work that you do, the funder actually might not be. And that's common. Even though funders might be funding in particular kinds of areas because they want to see outcomes within those kind of areas, they actually might not be that familiar with how that work happens on the ground. And so the professional language that would be maybe not as clear to people who aren't directly engaged in that professional work, you want to kind of avoid that where you can. You do want to use data and facts to support your case. I get the question a lot about citations. Are citations necessary? It really depends on the funder. Some funders like to see citations. Some funders, if you quote a statistic, want to know where you got that statistic. And so it's useful to say, with a little parentheses, you know, maybe the name of the article that you got it from and the date of the article, something like that. It doesn't have to be a full-on scientific citation, you know, for your grant. You're not going to have the space for it anyway. Another way to do it is to say, according to you know, 20% of children in Buncombe County are experiencing food insecurity, for example, something like that. So it's a way to be able to make that reference that kind of flows with what you're typing without having to put parenthetical citations throughout your writing. Okay. Okay. This is a super wordy slide. Lots of words here. So I tried to put some rainbow colors in so that the words wouldn't be too overwhelming, I hope. But these are really typical questions that you'll see on many, if not most, grant applications. So this can help to familiarize you with what you might be prepared to answer. So it's common to ask for a project summary as one of the very first questions. Some funders will actually give you example language with the question. So some funders will actually say, you know, begin your request with so-and-so requests X amount of dollars to, you know, complete whatever work. And then other funders don't necessarily provide that type of level of detail. And so they might just say, summarize your project. Regardless of what they're asking for in the fine print, I mean, follow what they're asking for in the fine print if they have it. But typically the project summary, useful language is your organization's name, requests, and then how much money you're requesting, and then talk about the work that you want to do. And within that summary, you're going to be referring to whatever challenge you're working to mitigate and your overall goals and results and how you're planning on achieving those goals and results within a very small space. So what you'll be doing here is basically repeating the language and numbers and information that you're going to be answering in more detail and complexity further on down the application. You don't really want to provide information in your project summary that you're not going to also say later on in your application. The point of the project summary is when funders are looking through applications, so many applications, and sometimes very quickly having to refresh their memory about what the application, what the gist of it was, the project summary is a really good way for them to be able to do that. So it's where you can just lay it out there very quickly and concisely so they can look at it and say, oh yes, they're asking for this amount to do this work to result in this, and this is why. Great, perfect. Another question is, what challenge are you addressing? This is definitely a data area. This is where you want to talk about what need exists and how you know that that need exists. Usually when they're asking for a challenge that you're addressing, they're not referring to your organizational challenge. So in other words, the challenge is not our organization needs dollars to do our work. That's the challenge, is that we need money. That's not usually what they're asking there. What they're usually asking is, what is the challenge that your work is addressing in the world? So make sure that you're talking about how you know that the need that you're addressing exists. Who will benefit from your work? So this is where you want to talk about all of the indicators, the number of people, their socioeconomic status, ages, specific neighborhoods or geographic area covered. All of that information is important. And if you have that information, that's where you want to get as specific as possible. You may not have all of that information, and that's okay, but whatever you do have, you want to be really detailed there. Evidence of success. So how will you know that you've achieved your goals? This is where you're going to be using output and outcome language, and also in the results section. So I'm going to explain just very quickly the difference between outputs and outcomes. So outputs are the amount of work you're doing. Okay, that's an output. So an example would be, we hosted 15 workshops. That is an example of an output. 15 would be the output. It's the number of workshops we hosted. An outcome would look like how many people benefited from participating in your workshops. That's an outcome, is how many people benefited and how did they benefit. So it's good to record both. Funders frequently ask for outcomes, and outputs are the easiest thing to measure. So it's good to have both. You're recording, you know, in that example, you're recording how many workshops you've put on, but also how many attendees do you have at those workshops? And then furthermore, if possible, how are those attendees better off? So did they learn something? Did they feel that the workshop taught them some new skills or new knowledge? How many people of the people who attended those workshops felt that they learned new skills or new knowledge from attending those workshops? That number is your outcome. The percentage of people who actually benefited from it, that's your outcome. So I hope that difference is clear. What is your project sustainability? This is a funny question that they always ask. How will this work be sustained beyond this funding? Of course, we know that in the nonprofit world, the vast majority of work is funded through grants. And so if you're applying for a grant to fund work, and you want that work to be sustained beyond that grant, the answer is you're going to apply for other grants. That's a real typical, that's how it works. Unfortunately, that's not always the answer they're looking for there. So a lot of times they want to know if you are becoming self-sustaining, if your project is becoming self-sustaining. Is it monetized in some kind of way that it can pay for itself over time? That's a tough one. Honestly, it's a tough one, and frequently the answer to that is no. Actually, a lot of this program work requires external funds in order to operate, and that is just the truth of the nonprofit world most of the time. So, excuse me, when you're answering this question, I recommend thinking about it creatively. Rather than just simply saying, we're going to apply for more grants, of course. I recommend thinking about what else makes your project sustainable. Because there's financial sustainability, but what else makes your project sustainable? So an answer to this might look like, we intend to diversify our funding for this program by applying to, and then name them, X, Y, and Z. You've identified these funders, you want to build relationships with them, you plan to apply to them for funding for this project. Go ahead and name them, it's fine. And through developing the skills of this, whatever population that you're serving, we anticipate that some of the need for these services over time will be reduced, which will require less external funding. Okay, so that's just an example of one way to look at financial sustainability. But sustainability can also look like having the same competent people involved with your work ongoing. It can look like really good evaluations to identify that your program is really well liked by the attendees, and so you anticipate having really solid numbers of attendance. So you're going to have a successful program, and more successful programs then can generate more income dollars typically, right? So anyway, all of that is to say, think creatively about sustainability. Most grant applications will ask you about that. So think in advance about how you might answer it. And then results. What results do you expect to achieve? So they want to know about outcomes here. They want to know what number of people will benefit by the outcomes that you're identifying. They want you to actually list the number. X number of people will attend. We anticipate that out of 15 workshops, we anticipate having 150 people attend. And out of those 150 people, 80% will identify that this workshop was useful for them, that they attain new skills or knowledge through participation in this workshop. That would be an outcome. Use specific numbers. Okay, and the last item on this slide is key steps and partners. So outline the major steps you will take to achieve your results and name your partners. I don't know if you can see the bottom of the screen because of my menu, but what that says is you want to name consenting partners who will be working with you on this project. Okay, I see that Emma raised a hand. So Emma, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and unmute yourself and you can ask your question.
Absolutely. Can you hear me? Does that work?
Yes. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I was just wondering specifically in the results section, if you could maybe speak to kind of the dynamic and what I see as a tension in terms of long-term and short-term outcomes or immediate kind of benefits, particularly for those of us who are maybe working in settings, especially I'm coming from a more environmental context, that a lot of the work we're doing is hard to measure immediately. And I mean, that could be said for human relationships as well. So just if you had any creative thoughts about results that are the harder to quantify, perhaps.
Yeah, that's great. So the short-term, long-term results question, that's a really good point, Emma. What you want to speak to with this particular section is whatever you can quantify in numbers. This question in this section, it is okay and it's good to include, if you have the space for it, to include the less quantifiable and the more kind of long-term goals of the work. That is okay to include in this, but you also want to include whatever the short-term results are for the period of time that you're being funded. So that's really what they're asking. They're asking, if you're being funded, if you're requesting funding for a particular period of time, like 1 year, let's say you have funding for 1 year, what is it that you hope to achieve within that 1 year? That's really what that question is referring to. Now, the longer term goals that aren't producing those same kind of results after 1 year, that take many years to be able to produce the types of results that you're looking for, you can still speak to that, but it may be that it's a different section where that information is more applicable. So it could be that in your project summary, you might list that, and then when you say, there's a question about the goals. What goals are you hoping to achieve that are separate from the results? The goals that's a good section to list that. Another is the section about the challenge being addressed. If the challenge that you're looking to address is, you want to slow down climate change. Well, nobody's going to do that in a year, right? So that's a long-term result that you can speak to about the challenge that's being addressed. And then also within that question, you can speak to, so what are the best practices or evidence-based solutions or work that we've found is successful to be able to positively impact those longer term goals like climate change. And so you're kind of setting up the idea that, yes, the ultimate goal is this much longer term result. But in the short term, these are the results that we think will indicate that we are on the right path to achieving the long-term results. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, that's really helpful.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you.
Okay, great. I want to just make one note real quick before we move on about key steps and partners. It is really important when you're listing partners in a grant application to not list partners who don't know that they're your partner. Everybody has experienced this at one time or another, likely, where they've been listed in someone else's grant application and they didn't even know about it. The context of this is that sometimes that's okay. Sometimes they're just asking who are your organizational partners, and you list out the people that you work with typically. You don't need to go contact every one of those organizations to say, hey, is it okay if I list you here? Because you already work with them all the time. They already know that you're their partner. If somebody were to ask them, hey, are you partnering with this group? They would say, yes, absolutely. I partner on these different things. So that's a particular kind of context, which you don't need to have explicit consent, let's say, for including them in the application. However, if what you're talking to, if what you're referencing is partners who are involved in the specific project that you're doing, who maybe you've written into the application in a kind of way that either they will be receiving funding or performing work of some kind that contributes to the work that is being described in your application or the results that you're hoping to achieve in your application, if you're listing people like that, you really have to get consent first, explicit consent. So you want to have that conversation first, right? You want to say, hey, we're planning on applying for this grant opportunity for this work that we think we could do together, or this work that we think, here's an important one, for this work that we think would benefit your community. So first of all, are you interested in that work? Would you like to be included in this application? What kind of role might you like to play in this work, right? Like you want to get really clear on all these things before you just start listing people. And it could be that you have this conversation at some point about, generally speaking, I'll give an example here for the Community Garden Network. This is a Bountiful Cities program that we run that supports community gardens all over the city, between 2 and 3 dozen community gardens. So it's sort of part of our directive that if you're part of the Community Garden Network, we're going to be supporting gardens in one way by drawing down funds to then be able to pass through for the purpose of purchasing plants or tools or equipment or supplies, things like that. So sometimes we'll use kind of a combination of things where a neighborhood, we try to reach out in advance, of course, and say, okay, we have this grant, we want to apply for these funds. Is this cool? Do you all still need this? You've said you need this before. Is this still something that would benefit you? Do you want to be included in this grant opportunity? And if we can't get a response right away, if we can't get a response and the application is due and we don't want to inadvertently cut a whole community out from the possibility of receiving the benefit of those funds, there are times that we'll say, okay, well, we work with this neighborhood frequently. We know that they like to be included in these things. We tried to reach out to them. We weren't able to get a response. We'll include them, but so that we're able to provide these funds if they so desire it. But then once we talk with them, it may be that we have to sub them out for somebody else who, they may say that, no, actually, we don't need that anymore. And we sub them out for somebody else. I'm not trying to overcomplicate this issue, but I do think it's a very important issue to be really intentional about when you're naming partners, and particularly when you're naming community partners in these grant applications. Okay, I'm gonna move on here to the next slide. Okay, here are some additional kind of common narrative applications you might see. Talk about your organization's history. Why is your organization well suited to carry out this work? So organization history is one of those things that you can have already written up and put in your organizational info for grants, for example, document, so that you can copy paste it. And then you can just edit it in order to make it really relevant to this specific funder. But all of those kind of key dates and times and figures and language you already have in place. That's one that I recommend having as part of your sort of inventory. All right, so key staff involved. What are the qualifications of the staff performing the work? One thing I want to make sure to let you all know, I see someone has their hand raised. I'm going to say this real quick and then I'll get to you with the question. The key staff involved, the qualifications of the staff performing the work. Qualifications look all different kinds of ways. Sometimes they look like professional qualifications, like so-and-so has this type of certification, or they have this type of professional experience. And sometimes the qualifications look like lived experience. And I will tell you that for a lot of funders, not all funders, but for a lot of funders, that lived experience, in other words, if you're hiring somebody who is from the neighborhood that you're working within, if you're hiring somebody that has experience, if you're working with people who are experiencing homelessness, and a member of your staff is a person who has themselves experienced homelessness, that is a qualification. And in fact, that is maybe the most important qualification that you can list with their consent. I mean, you don't want to out people with personal information that they may not feel comfortable sharing. You want to be clear with your staff about what is okay to include and what's not. But I just wanted to make sure that you all know that that counts and it's important. Okay, so somebody raised their hand. I can't see who it is, but if you can go ahead and unmute yourself, you can ask your question. No? Okay, I can't tell who it is. If somebody has a question, I'm going to continue on, but feel free to unmute yourself and you can ask your question. If you have a hard time unmuting yourself, you can go ahead and type your question into the chat box, and that's one way that we can try to answer it for you. Okay, next we have project timeline. So this is really similar to key steps, but you want to make sure to include the dates. So what needs to happen to enable this project to take place? What are the major events that are taking place? If you have the kind of project where you need to, I don't know, let's say it's an after-school program that you're starting. Okay, so you're going to have to go through a step where you're advertising for your program. That's a key step. That is going to have a date. What's the time frame you're doing that? And then maybe you need to be actively recruiting participants. Okay, so when are you recruiting? And then you're going to actually start the program. So when does that happen? Or maybe you need to hire staff. When does that happen? So that's the point, is go through, how do you make this happen? What are all the most important kind of elements of being able to make this project or program happen? And about when do you think these things are going to take place? And then how does this work align with the foundation's priorities or visions? Oh, speak their language right back to them. This is where that research is going to come in handy. If you've already done it, that you can say, well, the foundation has said that they prioritize providing education to children living in low wealth communities in this particular geographic area. We work in this particular geographic area providing education to children in these specific low wealth communities. Just use their own language even to explain how you fit, how you're a good fit. And then measurement tools. So what data collection strategies will you use to be able to record progress or to measure your results? Here's some examples. Pre and post surveys are an example. So a pre and post survey is before the activity takes place, the program activity, you survey participants to determine their level of understanding of whatever subject matter they're going to be participating in. Or maybe it's not understanding, maybe it's maybe you're trying to increase fruit and vegetable consumption, for example. So you might ask participants a simple survey kind of question at the beginning that says, how many servings of fruit and vegetables do you estimate that you're consuming per day on a daily basis, generally speaking? And then after you finish your program, after you complete the program activities, you ask the same question. And ideally, you want to see some type of change demonstrated over time. So that's one example. Participant reporting is another example. And this is where you don't necessarily have a pre and post, but you could say, so how was this for you? Did you learn things, or how has this affected you? You could find out that kind of way. And then there's behavior observation. I really like behavioral observation. It's one that I'm trying to, when I talk with funders, I really want us to try to move as much as possible away from invasive evaluation strategies and move toward intuitive evaluation strategies. So, for example, if you have a whole classroom of kindergartners and you're trying to increase their fruit and vegetable consumption, it's really hard to get them to quantify how many servings of fruit and vegetables they're eating. They might have a different answer on any different day. That's a weird question for them. That's a strange thing to ask. So how else might you understand that? It might just be that you watch your class and you observe that they're eating more fruits and vegetables over time. It's less formal, but to be honest, it's relaying the same information. So how can we move away from asking people participating in our work about their mental health if we are delivering food boxes, for example? How can we move away from asking invasive questions that discourage people from participating in this important work, just in the name of evaluation? So I think that we should have an evaluation revolution. Maybe you don't want to start with that on your grant applications, but I do recommend that if you can set it up to be easy to collect, easy to administer, non-invasive, as observational as possible, that's really, in my opinion, the best way to go. And if you can find best practices about measurement tools and evaluation strategies for the type of work you're doing, pay attention to that, see if you can replicate that. But honestly, I think we need to move away from the overburden of evaluation in the nonprofit world. Okay, so before we move on to the next section, I want to show you an actual grant application as an example. Okay, so this is a packet. This is a packet for the School Gardens Maintenance Project. This is an actual, oh my gosh, I'm out of water. This is an actual submitted, completed grant application that Bountiful Cities has submitted recently. You can see it's fiscal year 2021. We haven't gotten our funding verdict yet, so I can't actually tell you if this was a successful application. I certainly hope it was, but I just wanted to give you this as an example of a typical kind of application that you might see. So you'll see here some general kind of organization information, some basic information, the project name, the strategy. So in this case, this was kind of a drop-down menu. Recognizing that some projects will use more than one strategy, select the strategy that most closely applies to this project. So these are really, this funder is saying, here are the outcomes that we want to achieve, that we want to fund. You select which of these outcomes your work most aligns with. And then the funding request. So you can see this funding request amount for us, $18,600, is not a very large grant, but the reason is because I've done my research on this funder and I've applied to them before. And so I know kind of what range makes sense for the type of work that we're doing and for the type of deliverables we can offer, and for being a new applicant, an applicant that they haven't worked with before. So I went for this range because I didn't want to shoot for the moon. I wanted to do something that felt really reasonable for what this is in alignment with this funder's experiences. Have you read the grant guidelines? Yes. Nonprofit status. So this is where you would attach your 501c3 letter of determination from the IRS, or your fiscal agent's letter of determination if you're working with a fiscal agent. Board of directors, this is your board list. These are all these additional documents that we talked about before that you just want to have handy because they all ask for this stuff. And then here's the actual application, the narrative questions. So tell us about your organization. What's your mission? Highlight 2 or 3 key facts and accomplishments that best define your organization. This is all language that you can have written in advance. And then that's a whole question that you get to just copy, paste, make some adjustments to the language, and you're good to go. You don't have to rewrite that one every single time. Need for the project. What is the main issue this project is established to address? So that's like that, what is the challenge that you're looking to address question that we talked about earlier. What data or qualitative factors, stories are available to show that need? Now, this is interesting that they're asking for qualitative factors or stories, because as the question that we had before from, I think, Emma, she said some of this stuff is hard to quantify. For sure. So if one of the challenges that you're working to address doesn't necessarily have the quantifiable data that you can reference to demonstrate the need, then how do you know it's a need? Maybe it's because everybody has told you it's a need. You know, maybe it's because you've developed relationships within a particular community or a particular neighborhood, and you're hearing from people over and over again that there's this need. That counts. That's qualitative data that counts. So include that. Okay, this is, next is project. Explain the project and how it will work. Include the overall purpose and any models or evidence-based practices that will be included. What specific activities and milestones are included in the project plan? So this is a bunch of questions rolled into one. And that's common. That happens a lot. So we did sections on this that include key steps and an overall kind of description, all that kind of stuff. People served. How many people will be served by this project? Describe the people served, including demographics such as geography, income, race, ethnicity, age, etc. So we talked about this question before too. This is really common. This is where you want to get very specific. So just to look at this answer, scroll down. This project will serve 2,380 elementary and middle school students who currently participate in garden activities at 6 of the school sites and over 500, you know, da, 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 da. So the point is, be specific about who it is that you're planning to work with. Results. What results do you hope to achieve with this project? Be specific about how much impact the project will have in line with commissioner focus areas. So this is another complex question where you are answering about your overall kind of general results that you'll be able to measure. But also you're tying it back to what the funder has stated their priority areas are. They've said, we have these focus areas. We want to fund this kind of work. So you're going to be also saying, we think that this work will achieve this result within this focus area. So you kind of have both happening there. Evaluation. How will you know you have succeeded? Explain the project evaluation process, including specific measures that will be tracked. This is what we talked about. So how are you doing pre and post tests? Is that how you know that these test scores or that people, how do you know that there's increased fruit and vegetable consumption, for example? Are you doing pre and post tests? If you are, that's what you want to speak to. Are you just observing that children are trying all kinds of new vegetables and things? If that's your method, speak to that. Now, I will say that even though I kind of went off a little bit about the evaluation revolution that I want to see happen, I will tell you that on the other side of things, funders like data, and they want to see the most statistically accurate data that they can. Okay, so if it's easy to be able to give them statistically accurate data, if that's possible and easy and non-invasive, you want to go for that. Okay. Collaboration. List any formal and or supportive partners. Here we are. This is where you're talking about your partners. Describe their roles in the project. How will they make it stronger? So this is where you don't want to be listing people who have no idea that they're working with you. If you're talking about people who have roles in the project, they should already know that they have those roles, or you've at least had that conversation with them if this is a brand new project or program. Budget. So download a copy of the budget form here. Frequently, funders almost always have their own budget form that you have to complete. And even though you've already done your budget in advance, their budget form might look different. So you have to translate your budget into their budget form. Make sure when you're looking at the whole application in the beginning that if they have their own budget form, you're allowing enough time for that translation, because sometimes it's tricky. It depends on your fiscal year. If your fiscal year lines up with their fiscal year, for example, or not. If it doesn't line up, some funders are okay with you just listing your fiscal year. And then some funders actually want you to translate your budget into their fiscal year. And that's kind of a pain in the butt, but it takes time. But if that's what's required, you want to know that in advance. And then there's a budget narrative here. A lot of times they ask for you to explain your budget in addition to just attaching it. Other county funding. So how else are you being funded by this particular funder? Sustainability. We talked about this one. How will the project continue to succeed after the funding of the grant? Explain your plan for making this an ongoing effort. So you can see here, they're not specifically saying how will the project continue to be funded after this funding ends. That's kind of implied as part of what they mean, but it's not the only thing that they need, okay? So that's why we were talking about earlier, with sustainability questions, think creatively. Think about funding in terms of sustainability, but also what else? What else makes this project's ongoing success assured? Okay, optional information. It doesn't have an impact on scoring, but it's helpful to the committee. You don't see this very frequently, but sometimes in grants. Partial funding, if you were to be given less than what you're asking for, what factors would need to be considered? So like, could you still do the work if we gave you less money or not? I will tell you that that's a tricky one, because some funders will say, oh, well, if you can still do the work if we give you less money, then we will give you less money. And some funders will say, oh, you can't do the work if we give you less funding, then we need to give you all the funding. Maybe I just said the same thing two different ways. I'm trying to say that sometimes the way you answer could be viewed in two different ways by the funder. So just be honest there and hope for the best. Resource support. Beyond this grant request, how can Buncombe County support your organization with this project and in strengthening your work? That's a fabulous question that you really don't see very often from funders. So kudos to this funder for asking that question. So how else can funders support the work of organizations and nonprofits? Well, there's a sphere of influence there, right? Funders are actually connected to people who have power in different kinds of ways, frequently more so than the organizations on the ground doing the work. Not always, but frequently, right? And so what could that mean? That could mean advocacy for causes or policy changes that are important to remove barriers for the work that you're trying to do or for the people that you're looking to impact. It could look like connections, introductions to other funders or to volunteers or all kinds of people who might be out there in the world that might be able to support your work. So yeah, so think about if you get the good fortune of being able to answer that question, I hope that more funders begin to answer that. Think about how else could you potentially partner with them beyond just the money. And then is there anything else that you want them to know? That does get asked commonly. So that question is basically, if there's something that is important that you didn't have the chance within the other questions in the application to really get that point across, use that space to do it. Okay, so this application, what I'm going to run through really quick now is the attachments, so you can see that. Okay, so there's the 501c3 letter. It looks like this. This is what the 501c3 letter. It's a real weird kind of generic looking letter from the IRS with a date that has your EIN, your employer identification number, which is the same thing as your tax ID number. That's what that is, your EIN. And it just states that you've been approved. Keep that on file somewhere. Don't lose that letter. It's very important. Here's the board of directors list. This is a typical kind of board of directors list. You see there's the name, the position that they hold on the board, like the chair, the secretary, the treasurer, if they're an officer of the board. It has their address, it has their contact information, it has their profession, and it has their term of service. So this is a lot of information, and this can even seem like maybe too much information to include about your board of directors, but a lot of funders require exactly this information. So if you already have your own board of directors list you've put together that you have on file that has all the information that they typically ask for, you don't have to recreate it every time. One question that I've gotten in the past is, what is a term of service? What does that mean? So board members frequently will have a term of service, which is like 2 years or 3 years. And it's to say, when they come on as a board member, they agree to stay on the board for a particular length of time. That's the term of service. And so you would say, you know, if they're in their first term, that they're in their first term of 3 years and the date that it ends. Okay, so that's an example of the type of information that it's detailed, and you don't want to have to collect that every time. And every year you want to update your list. So this is a board of directors list for 2019. Now that we're in 2020, I'll go through this list and make sure that everything is updated, that we're not, for example, here we have a board member with a term of service that is listed as ending. If that person is renewing their term, then I'll update that on the list. Okay, we have strategic partnership grants. This is just an example of what a grant budget might look like for the budget form that they give you. So this is their budget form. This is not my budget form. And I've gone through and translated my program budget for this grant into their form. So I just wanted to give you an example of what that frequently looks like, is that you have the expenses delineated here between the proposed grant, other funds, total costs. And the reason why I want to mention that is because one thing I had said earlier is that you want to have an overall program budget that maybe you've already done in advance, that's not specific to this grant. It's just the overall costs of running your program, because you're going to be referencing those overall costs frequently in grant applications that are specific to your program. Okay, so you're going to want to be able to list those numbers and list them consistently and easily each time without having to recreate that budget each time for the overall programs. And then these are examples of letters of support. Okay, so these are letters that we've collected over time about our program. I have a lot of them here because I wanted to really impress upon the funder the fact that this is the type of program that is found to be very beneficial by a lot of different parents and schools and partners. That can speak volumes. Having good letters of support can really go a long way and can sometimes mean the difference of getting your grant or not. And so I just wanted to also say about letters of support that one thing you want to do is, if you're going to ask for letters of support from people, you want to give them enough time in advance to be able to respond to your request. Okay, so what does that mean? If you need a grant, if a grant is due on Friday, you don't want to ask on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday for a letter of support. You want to ask them at least the week before, maybe 2 weeks before. And even ideally, you want to have created some type of template that they can actually reference as they're writing the letter that they're submitting for you, so that they're not having to create something totally from scratch in their head. In other words, you want to make it as easy as possible for people to be able to provide you letters of support. You don't want to make it a burden that people don't want to actually be able to accommodate you with. Otherwise, you'll have a harder time getting those letters. These are some photos that I included in this grant application of before and after, just kind of demonstrating the effectiveness of the work. If you can do that, if you can include photos, photos speak volumes. Okay, so I'm going to come out of this example. I also want to just mention, I know that this grant is being recorded, this workshop is being recorded, and it will be made available later for other folks to view. All of the personally identifiable information from this real example of our grant that was submitted of our organization, I want folks to know that I will scrub that from the recorded version. I wanted to show you an actual real example, but before this is able to be viewed by other people, that personally identifiable information is not going to be included. So I just wanted to make a note of that. Okay, so this next section is about uploading attachments. So we already talked about a lot of these pieces. I'm not going to spend as much time on this. I just do want to make sure that you all know that this can take a lot of time. The attachments take a long time, especially if you need to be able, if you have to put everything in one PDF to upload, which is common, that happens a lot, they ask for that, but you have like, you know, a dozen different documents that you need to try to upload, you're going to have to do something called merge your PDFs. So the way that you merge your PDFs is you can find a free online site, and I'm going to show you. I'm going to try to click on this link if my little menu bar will go away so I can click on it. Here we go. So, well, that's not convenient. The menu bar is in my way to be able to click on the link. There we go. Here we go. So this is an example of a free PDF merge site. So it's really simple. You just go to the site, you choose the file that you want, the files that you want to merge from your computer, and then you hit merge files. It puts it into one PDF. You hit download now, and that downloads the PDF, and then you can upload that single PDF with all of those different documents into your attachment area. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that. That was one thing that actually took me a while to figure out, so there's no need for that. You all should just know how to do that. I want to make sure we covered all this stuff. Most recent 990 or compilation report, we talked about that earlier. That's frequently requested. Okay, next we have budgeting your time. And speaking of budgeting time, I just want to let you all know that I know this is a long webinar and it's a lot of information, but we're almost done. This is the last slide before we actually just go into questions. And I would want to remind folks that before you leave, if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and put a poll up when we get through these slides, and you can just give me a little bit of feedback about how this workshop was for you. The feedback is really important because I use that feedback to make this better. It's a free workshop, but I want it to be as good as it can be to really get the information across to as many people as possible. So budgeting your time. You really want to allow adequate time for completing each question on the application. So how long does it take to actually write each question? As an experienced grant writer, I can say that I spend around at least 30 minutes on every narrative question. And that's if I don't have to do any kind of additional research. Now, if I need to do additional research, that might take 1 to 2 hours per question, depending on what they're asking. So that's some of the information that's really handy to have up front. Like, how do you know that the need exists, the challenge that you're working to meet through this work that you're doing? What statistics exist, what data exists to support the fact that this is a need? That is all information that you can find in advance and store, so you don't have to look it up every time. So especially now that there is such an emphasis on social determinants of health, for so many of the funders in our area in particular, and maybe nationally, if you know your social determinant of health area, so for example, I'll just explain quickly social determinants of health. It's kind of new, almost buzzy language that's being used to talk about how health outcomes are affected not just by whether or not people go to the doctor, but they're also affected by food security, and if they have access to affordable housing, stable housing. They're affected by their environment, environmental factors, education. So all of these different areas that people are doing work in the nonprofit world, almost all of these areas end up being a social determinant of health. If you can find the information that shows that link about your area of work and how it's a social determinant of health, and how you know that the work you're doing contributes to health outcomes and best practices, if you can compile that research in advance, you don't have to do it every time. I really recommend that because they're going to ask every single time. Okay, so time for final review and revisions. It's around 5 to 10 minutes per question is what I usually spend. I really want to take my time taking a look at each question and making sure that what I wrote makes sense, you know, remove any kind of grammatical errors, things like that. I want to say about that, something that's really important is that if you don't allow yourself enough time to have the time built in to step away from your application before you hit submit, you can sometimes get, you know, sometimes you end up submitting an application that could have been a little better if you had built that additional time in, because oftentimes I find, and even as a pretty experienced grant writer, that I am just on fire when I'm writing. I'm just, ooh, you know, the words are flying on the page and everything makes so much sense. And, you know, I think that I'm saying everything the right way. And then I step away from it and I come back, I give it some time and I look at it and I realize, wow, that sentence doesn't even make sense. You know, you want to give yourself the time to take a fresh look with fresh eyes and make sure that what you're saying is really the way you want to say it before you submit it. So build that time in. Time for copying and pasting responses into the online application and uploading supporting documentation. This is something that, you know, you wouldn't think that this takes a long time. You've been, oh, sorry about that. You've been you've been working in your Google Doc or your Word document on all these narrative questions, it'll just take a quick sec to copy paste it into the online portal. Well, it might or it might not. Online portals, as I mentioned before, can be notoriously glitchy. So give yourself a good couple of hours. Don't come down to the wire and say, well, it'll just take 5 minutes. Give yourself time to be able to copy and paste everything back into the online portal, and especially for uploading all of the supporting documentation. Sometimes that stuff just doesn't work. It just doesn't function the way it's supposed to, and you have to try it and try it and try it again. And the worst thing is to be on deadline and the technology fails you and you miss your deadline. So build adequate time in for that. So a recommendation that I like to give everybody is to block out adequate time on your schedule for doing nothing but grant writing. Don't try to fit grant writing in around an already busy schedule. So I use a paper planner. This is a WeMoon. It's not a Google Calendar. It's not on my phone. I like paper planners. I'm not necessarily recommending that over other kind of planners. It's what I use. But when I am blocking out time for myself, I literally block out days where I'll write the date that a grant is due, and then I'll just cross through 3 days in advance of that date and just write grant writing. And that tells me I am not scheduling meetings during those days. If I absolutely have to, I might schedule 1 meeting, but I'm not having typical days. I'm not having 3 meetings, 4 meetings, 5 meetings on those days, because otherwise what will happen is I'll end up having to write my grant at night, at home, when I'm tired and I'm not writing my best and I'm stressed out. And you don't want to have to do that, because then grant writing is no fun. It's no fun to write grants when you're stressed out. So give yourself the time, build the space and time to be expansive with taking your time on every component, on your research, on your narrative questions, on your budget, on making those phone calls in advance to the program officer. And that's not the kind of stuff that happens 3 days in advance. That stuff happens weeks in advance. So when I say I'm blocking out 3 days, I mean I'm blocking out 3 days after I have already done the budget. I've already done the research. I've already had the conversations with the program officers. That's 3 days of just writing, of writing narrative responses. That's it. Okay. So I think that is it about budgeting your time. So now I'm going to move into the last slide. And now, because we're in the last slide, I'm going to go ahead and also put this poll out there. So you all can see this. You can just move it to the side if you want, move it around, but please don't leave until you filled it out so that I have your feedback. It's a quick multiple box kind of checklist, check whichever is applicable to you. Here's a couple more resources for you on this page. The North Carolina Center for Nonprofits has a lot of really good information. WNC Nonprofit Pathways has a lot of good information to support nonprofit organizations in their work. Sometimes Bountiful Cities can help with fiscal agency. So I have us listed there as well. And you can call or email me. My information is listed there. I am available as much as I'm able to be available. As much as my capacity allows, I will, I'm happy to help. Like I said, I think that this is, I want people to have access to the resources that you all need in order to do the work that you want to do. So now I'll just stop and ask if anybody has any questions. Any questions or comments? You can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask if you'd like.
Nicole, I'll say something. Thanks. um, it was 3 hours, but all 3 hours made kind of filled gaps. I couldn't have told you where my gaps were, but I got something out of it. And as much as anything, I want to recommend other people that I work with, or that people that are building capacity in their leadership, to, take the time to just learn the language and just take it in one step further. So I appreciate you. That's what this was to me, and I think it's very valuable. So thanks.
Oh, thank you. I'm happy to hear that it was useful information. Okay, well, if nobody else has any questions or comments, you're certainly welcome, as I said, to email me or text me if questions arise later. I'll just remind everybody that I am going to provide the slides in PDF form, as well as all of the attachments, all the different kind of supporting documents that we looked at today, minus personally identifiable information. I will be sending those out to everybody after the workshop. Probably not today, because I'm going to hop offline here and spend some time with my family, but you will get it within the next few days. So I appreciate all of you participating, and please do let me know if you need any kind of help or have questions, and please remember to fill out your poll before you leave. Thank you so much.